Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be discussing the straw proposal for Phase 2 of the RA Enhancements Initiative. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by our two presenters, Anya Gilbert and Bridget Sparks from Policy Development. We also have a few others from Policy on the line. We have Greg Cook, John Gooden, Gabe Murtaugh, Partha Malvadkar. And then we also have David Zlotlow, our Senior Counsel, on the line, Abdul Muhammad Ali from Operations Engineering Services, and then Priyanka Namburi from our Model and Contract Implementation team on the line as well. The presentation, as well as the proposal that we'll be discussing today, was posted on the initiative webpage. You can navigate to that page by going to kaiso.com, and then under the Stay Informed tab, you can click the Stakeholder Initiatives page, and then it'll be listed there on that main page under Resource Adequacy, and then it will be on that page. So just a few reminders before we get started today. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be repeated without the ISO's permission. Today's meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives, and while we always welcome comments and feedback, just a reminder to please keep those professional and respectful. And then lastly, please just try and be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so that we can manage the time efficiently today and address as many questions and comments as possible. To raise your hand during today's call, if you use the Call Me option when you join the WebEx, then you can select the raised hand icon, which is located above the chat window, located just on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. If you dialed in separately to the conference and did not use that Call Me option, you'll need to press #2 on your telephone keypad to join the queue. And when it's time for questions, we'll go over those instructions again. If you need technical assistance anytime during today's call, you can send a chat to the event producer. Today's event producer is Michelle. And then just a reminder, if you do enter that verbal queue, please just be sure to state your name and affiliation before making your comment. You can also send your question or comment into the chat. You can send it to either myself, again, my name is Isabella Nicosia, or you can send it to all panelists. And again, if you do utilize the chat, just be sure to put your name and organization or affiliation in there as well, and I'll read it out to our panelists. So the agenda for today, we're going to start off with the must offer and bid insertion topic. So Anya will be covering that. And then we'll hand it over to Bridget Sparks to cover the flexible RA, and then also the implementation EIM governing body role. And then we'll have some time left over at the end for some Q&A before we go into next steps. So this slide here shows where we are currently at in the stakeholder process. We are here under proposal development at the straw proposal. And then here we have our proposed initiative schedule for Phase 2 of the initiative. So we're here at the stakeholder meeting, October 12th. We will be taking comments until October 26th on the Phase 2 straw proposal. Between now and December, we will work to develop the BRS and the tariff. And then in November, we plan to put out the draft final proposal and draft tariff for Phase 2, and then hold a stakeholder meeting and have an open comment period on those. And then we'll be posting the final proposal sometime in December with the comments due in January, and then that will lead us to the February Board of Governors to present those Phase 2 elements. And again, just to note, these dates are tentative and subject to change, so we will confirm all dates in a notice through the daily briefing. So with that, I will hand it over to Anya Gilbert, and we'll get started with the must offer obligations and bid insertion topic.
I'm going to start with where we left things off in resource adequacy Phase 1 and how that brings us to where we are today with Phase 2. As a refresher, KAISO's 6th revised draw proposal as a part of Phase 1 proposed a standard 24/7 day ahead and real-time must offer obligation with bid insertion for storage, use limited resources, and conditionally available resources with limited exceptions. It also proposed setting the must offer obligation as equal to the deliverable qualifying capacity. Those phase 1 issues were deferred to phase 2, which is the focus of today's call. I'm going to walk through the previous feedback we received on the must offer proposal made in phase 1, CAISO's response to that feedback, and then I'll review the proposals being made to the must offer and bid insertion rules. So the first area of feedback had to do with a discussion regarding removing the real-time must offer. Energy Division and to varying degrees, the 3 IOUs and Shell highlighted concern that it may be premature to remove the real-time must offer obligation prior to testing the day-ahead market enhancements and the imbalance reserve product. And in response, CAISO proposes to maintain the real-time must offer obligation and then observe the results during a transition period when DAME is implemented and the RA resources are still required to meet their real-time must offer obligations, regardless if they've received a reliability capacity or imbalance reserve award. Next slide. Another theme of feedback received had to do with the storage and investment tax credit considerations. Stakeholders raised concerns that imposing a must offer obligation for the full charging in addition to discharging capabilities for storage could cause storage resources to diminish or lose their investment tax credit when the resource charges from the grid. To this point, CAISO continues to assert that the availability shouldn't be limited by contractual limitations, and we've offered a few ways that the resources can reduce charging from the grid, albeit not completely, but partially by self-scheduling their resources in real time after economically bidding and receiving their day-ahead awards to align with the hours of when solar is online. They can also utilize minimum and max hour state of charge parameters to match those day-ahead awards. Additionally, there's options to submit economic bids, since market prices today imply that charging can happen when solar is online. Next slide. Additionally, in phase 1, CAISO had proposed that the must offer obligations equal the deliverable qualifying capacity. And in response and in recognition of the CPUC decisions related to track 3B2, in addition to stakeholder feedback, CAISO is going to pause this update to set the must offer obligations to the deliverable qualifying capacity shown for RA, and we'll review this again in phase 3 in order to maintain alignment with the timing and decisions of the CPUC's track 3B2 workshops. Next slide. The last category of feedback that we received related to stakeholder requests for a redline BPM on the updated must offer and bid insertion requirements associated with the proposal. And in response, we have attached to the appendix of the proposal proposed redlines of the reliability requirements BPM table 7.1.1 for stakeholders to review. So at this point, I'd like to pause and see if there are any questions. Maybe Nicolette, or excuse me, Isabella or Michelle.
So as a reminder, if you use the call me option in WebEx, you can raise your hand by pressing the raise hand icon located on the right-hand side above the chat window. And if you dialed in separately to the conference, then you'll need to press #2 to enter the question queue. And Michelle, will you let us know if we have any questions?
Absolutely, I will let you know. And there are currently no questions in queue.
All right, well, let's move on then. Well, in this section, I'll be describing CAISO's proposal and clarifications, and I'll start with why we're taking this on. The purpose of these updated must offer and bid insertion rules are really to increase the number of resources available and eligible for bid insertion, including storage for the charge and discharge portions of the storage resources, these limited resources and conditionally available resources. CAISO is re-emphasizing its must offer requirements and also highlighting that resources will receive bid insertion unless exempt. Next slide. So getting into the specifics, To start with, storage and hybrid resources will have a day-ahead and real-time must-offer obligation, which reflects the charge and discharge capabilities of the resource. And this is intended so that CAISO can fully optimize the resource's full range. Previously, the must-offer was for the discharge capabilities, and this change is going to clarify that the must-offer also applies to the charging capability. The other change is for use-limited resources and conditionally available resources. The day-ahead and real-time must-offer obligation will apply to both use-limited and conditionally available resources unless the underlying technology has a different must-offer obligation. Additionally, to clarify, the RUC availability bids are already required for use-limited resources and will now be required for conditionally available resources as well. If the resource is unavailable, this unavailability can be communicated through outage cards. Next slide. So here the CAISO offers a few clarifications on the must-offer rules for specific resource types. First, for eligible intermittent resources, the CAISO isn't proposing a change, but rather we are clarifying that any energy above the resource's NQC cannot be used to support an export from non-RA capacity. And to add color, even though the RA value under an ELCC might be lower or higher than what the resource can produce, since the RA value is static and the resource capability varies, the must-offer obligation to the CAISO is for all of the energy. And for demand response, the CAISO is clarifying that the days and hours that the DR resource is obligated to bid into the market needs to be clearly communicated through local regulatory agency approved documentation. This can include contract provisions, approved program designs, or decisions. If there aren't parameters established by that local regulatory authority, the resource must follow the standard must-offer obligation. Next slide. The final change to the must-offer and bid insertion rules is to the bid insertion changes. And here the CAISO proposes to apply bid insertion both to use-limited resources and conditionally available resource unless the underlying technology is exempt. So I do see a question from Alva. Michelle, could you unmute Alva?
Absolutely. Alva, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Oh, great. Thank you. Good to talk to you. Anya, can you hear me?
Yes, coming in clear, Alva.
One question I had about the battery must-offer obligation was if a battery was not supplying its full range, would essentially the must-offer be not considering the efficiency losses? It would just simply be for the same amount on the charge side as on the discharge side? Is that the range that would be required?
The availability would need to be communicated. So if it's a standard limitation that applies in all hours, that might need to be reflected in the master file versus reflected in outage cards if that's more dynamic. I know we have Gabe here as well. I don't know, Gabe, if you want to elaborate on that. Did I get that right, Alva?
Not quite. I was just thinking of the situation where a 200 megawatt battery has a 100 megawatt flex RA or total RA obligation, let's just say system and flex. So because the obligation is the same now for both. So if it only has 100 megawatts out of its 200 megawatts, then the must offer on the discharge side would be 100. I'm just checking that the must offer on the charge side would also be 100 in that case.
Hey, Alva, this is Gabe Murtaugh. Yeah, I think the easy answer to your question is yes. That would be the requirement.
Right. Okay, it wouldn't be the full range. It would be the range that would cover. It would essentially be equated to the RA quantity, which previously had a discharge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabe.
Yep.
Appreciate that.
All right. We are going to move to the next question in queue. Carrie, your line's unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Carrie.
Great, thanks. I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your ITC position. I understand that it's the CAISO's preference for the ITC to be reflected in economic offers, but I know you guys are also aware that, something like 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts of contracts have been signed for storage that prevent grid charging. And it's a federal tax credit, and the CAISO operates a federal tariff, so it just seems really odd to me that you wouldn't design a market to, accommodate this. I'm just wondering if you could just explain more of your thinking.
Hey, Carrie, this is Gabe Murtaugh again. Yeah, I appreciate your question, and I agree with you. We've gotten a lot of statements and input from the storage community about the ITC, and I do think that, we are going to need to be thinking critically about how to make accommodations for resources with ITC. Now, with that said, we are procuring these resources for resource adequacy, just like other resources within the construct. And for storage resources, we do need to make sure that, the storage resources are charged so that we can have them available for use to meet system peak loads and peak net loads. So that's sort of where our thinking is right now. Obviously, we also have the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative open currently. And in that initiative, we will be talking about potential allowances for standalone storage and co-located storage that do have ITC, and what that might mean for how the ISO operates those resources, and if it's something we want to, track and master file and have special, accommodations for when we're dispatching the resources. Right now, we don't obviously have any of that put in place, but that is something that the ISO is thinking about. Does that help at all?
It does. I was thinking just as you were talking, that was really helpful. And I was thinking about how you're saying you're not going to change the wind and solar rules. And the way that the unavailability is addressed on that side is through resource counting. Wind and solar are heavily discounted. And the CPUC recently did the same for ITC storage, and they changed the way the NQC is calculated, particularly for hybrid resources that have the ITC. And now it's different than for hybrid resources without it. So I think it would be helpful to fold in how the resource counting rules are working for the ITC hybrid resources into this presentation, because I think that might help address some of your concerns.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Maybe if you'd forward me, and the RAE team here, just some of that information and kind of what you were thinking about that, we can kind of kick some of those ideas around internally as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
But I agree. I think those are the ideas that the CPUC are trying to address kind of align with what we're thinking about here. And we should probably at least talk about that in this initiative, if not do something to address it specifically.
Yep. Thank you, Gabe.
Yep. Thanks for the comment, Carrie.
All right. I do not see any additional questions in queue. I think there's one question in the chat, though.
Yeah, let me go ahead and read that question out. It's from CISA. It says, previously, CISA has noted that establishing a MOO for the charge portion of storage assets might be complicated, especially for WDAT storage, since they are subject to more stringent charge limitations. Has the ISO given thought on how to manage this?
Sure. Thanks for that question. And I think that's part of the point I tried to raise in response to Alva's question, interpreting that as limitation related. When there are limitations in place, CAISO does want to know about those. If that is going to be kind of a constant limitation as a result of interconnection at the distribution level, that could be reflected if it's a flat limitation in that those master file parameters If it's more dynamic, that could be reflected in outage cards.
Thanks, Anya.
All right. It looks like Alva may have gotten back into the queue. Alva, your line's unmuted. You may go ahead.
Yeah, I had one related question, which was what is, I'm not presenting this as strategic behavior, but it seems to me that any hybrid resource that did not want to charge outside of solar hours could simply set its dynamic limits using the dynamic limit tool so that there was no charging available. Am I incorrect in thinking that?
Hey, Alva, this is Gabe again. I think I can field this one. So you're mostly correct in that. The hybrid resource model, part of the reason it was developed the way that it was so that these combined solar plus storage facilities could potentially have this functionality where they didn't necessarily have to charge from the grid. And I think the way that a hybrid resource does that is they simply have a P-min set equal to 0 megawatts. And currently today that is applicable. And obviously any kind of, resource adequacy Mustoffer obligations would only apply to, the characteristics of a resource that are registered in master file. Now, standalone storage and co-located storage, they have to have a charging portion of their resource registered in master file. Otherwise, they would never receive instructions to charge, even when on-site solar is generating. But you are correct. Hybrid resources don't necessarily have that same restriction, and that's part of the reason why we have, why we developed the hybrid model in the first place. Specifically to the hybrid dynamic limit tool, which is functionality we are planning to implement this coming spring, that functionality is meant to model times when, solar is not at 100%, times when the underlying storage component might be fully charged or fully discharged. It could also be used to just clarify or flag to the ISO that part of the capacity of the resource is being used to charge the on-site battery, and it's unavailable for dispatch to the grid. And those are the primary reasons why we would expect to see things, derated, if you will, through the hybrid dynamic limit process.
If I'm understanding you correctly, so your first layer of the answer is that a hybrid resource that could only charge from the solar could simply have a P-min of 0, and that would then allow it to satisfy the rules as an RA resource of bidding its full range. And your inclination is to think that limiting the charge range would have to be based on some actual physical inability to charge in the dynamic tool. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Yep, thanks, Alva.
All right. I do not see any additional questions in queue at this time.
I do see one that just came in through the chat, a follow-up question from CISA. It is our understanding that hybrid assets may not have a P-min of 0 in the master file. They might be modeled closer to an NGR by having a negative P-min. Is this correct?
Yeah. Hey, Sergio, this is Gabe. We may have to follow up on specifics if you're thinking about a particular resource. I think the conversation that I was just having with Alva was sort of one of the drivers behind developing the hybrid resource model in the first place. And that was so that we could potentially model, facilities that have solar and storage or wind and storage as a resource with a P-min of 0, so that they wouldn't be charging from the grid necessarily. That does obviously put the burden on the hybrid resource scheduling coordinator to make sure that the resources are charged. But that's, I think those are the requirements that we were thinking about when we developed the model in the first place. Now, there could be other considerations once you're talking about developing these values in master file, and what can be used there, and that's determined on a resource by resource basis. But that's what I just said is my understanding at this point. I think Sergio, if you've got specific questions, maybe you and I could chat offline, talk about that.
Okay, another question in the chat. It sounded like the ISO said the DLT can be used to manage ITC grid charging. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, let me be specific. So the dynamic limit tool is the functionality that we're introducing, that was discussed through the hybrid resources policy, which we finished up last year. That policy, or that piece of the policy, is going to be implemented in spring of 2022. So that's not functionality that exists in the market yet. But what the dynamic limit tool does is it allows hybrid resources specifically, so that's when you're modeling your solar plus storage facility as a single resource ID with a single bit curve to the ISO, if that underlying solar component is not capable of producing its full output, so if you've got a 100 megawatt underlying solar component and the sun's only shining partially and you can only get 80 megawatts off of your resource, you can signal that unavailability of that 20 megawatts to the ISO, since the sun's not going to be able to provide the full 100 megawatts. That's going to reduce the total amount of output that the ISO might get from your hybrid resource. So unavailability from an on-site wind or solar resource is one reason you can use a dynamic limit tool and submit an alteration to the maximum or the minimum your resource is capable of producing. You might also have limitations on your storage resource. Specifically, if you're at very, very high states of charge, you might not be able to charge anymore. Or if you're at very low states of charge, you might not be able to discharge anymore. And then the third reason you can use a dynamic limit tool to signal partial unavailability to the ISO is if you're doing on-site charging. Like you've got 100 megawatts of solar coming off of your storage resource. Part of that is going into your battery. So you're gonna, and you want part of that to be going into the battery for some period of time. You can signal that through unavailability in the dynamic limit tool to the ISO. Now, outside of those, three reasons in general, that's what you can submit to the ISO in terms of an update, a dynamic limit update to what your hybrid resource is capable of producing. And again, that functionality is not available and won't be available until the spring of 2022. What you can't do is just say, oh, this particular interval, I don't feel like producing up to the full 150 megawatts. I only want to offer 110 megawatts or 95 megawatts to the ISO, for whatever reason, or potentially 0 megawatts on the negative end, and then just have that in place for a certain period of time. That's not permissible. And those rules are spelled out in the hybrid resources policy, and we will be developing tariff language with relation to the dynamic limit tool and what it does do and what it doesn't do. And well, actually, I think that's already at FERC right now in an approval process. But essentially, it does outline what you can do and can't do with the dynamic limit tool. So I think the very short answer is that no, you can't use the dynamic limit tool to just manage grid charging whenever you want to. Sorry for the long answer there.
All right. We do have a question on the phone. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi there. This is Chris Devin from Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
All right. Just had to add some thoughts on this discussion of the hybrid limit, hybrid resources dynamic limit tool and the ITC stuff, because I was just curious as to if CAISO would, consider that, that whole last explanation. Thank you for that, Gabe. I feel like it would be a really good tool to allow for the resource to still have and maintain a large amount of flexibility, particularly for their EFC of the resource, effective flexible capacity of the resource, would be significantly reduced if you were to get rid of that negative side of the resource and set its P-min at 0. I understand that's what CAISO wants to do right now. I would just encourage you to reconsider that and maybe think about allowing the dynamic limit tool to be used for this purpose as well. I understand there's some concern about the withholding from the market or ability to maybe use it for gaming or other manipulative type purposes, but I also think that there is a need for this flexibility to really be reflected, and I think you lose a whole bunch of the flexibility that's provided by the storage components of these batteries and nearly all, or these hybrid resources, I should say, and nearly all of these ones coming in with storage in the hybrid and co-located resources are really going to have those ITC considerations for the next 5+ years. So just encourage you to take a look at that a little bit more. And I guess one of the other things I would just mention on that tariff language is that it wasn't really explicitly clear that those were the only reasons that you could use it the way that I was reading it during that tariff development. So perhaps that's something that could maybe be using some clarification or something like that in the future. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Chris. I think at the absolute least, we definitely want to kind of have this same conversation in the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative, and we'll keep that in mind as we're developing policy here. But thank you for that feedback.
Thanks.
All right, let's see. I do not see any additional questions in queue at this time.
Okay, thanks. I'll hand it over to Bridget Sparks to cover the Flexray topic. Bridget? Great. Thank you, Isabella. So please go to the next slide. So the CAISO wanted to sort of take a moment to level set where we've been with Flexray, since we haven't talked about this topic since January of 2020. So just to sort of revisit where the CAISO has been and what our thinking had been on this topic, really the key question around Flexray was how do we align it with the new day-ahead market enhancements design? So in prior STAR proposals, the CAISO had sought to align the Flexray product with a new inbound reserve product under development in DAME. And so this new Flex product, the Flex requirements would move to be based around an uncertainty product that the inbound reserve is trying to solve, rather than Flexray being designed around the predictable set ramping product of the 3-hour net load ramp that it's currently designed around. And so we had proposed the Flex requirements be based on the largest expected inbound reserve need plus a monthly adder. We'd also proposed to modify the effective flexibility capacity calculation to be moving from what the resource can ramp over a 3-hour period to what is the largest 15-minute ramping capability of the RA resource, which would also then require that Flex RA resources be 15-minute dispatchable. And then we would be relying on system and local resources and the interties to meet the predictable 3-hour daily net load ramp. And then, again, pivot the Flex RA requirements to address uncertainty needs.
So what we'd really been thinking about is that we felt like the day-ahead market could sufficiently schedule, hourly block resources to cover that predictable 3-hour net load ramping period, and where the key flexibility lied was on this uncertainty product that the inbound reserve is designed to cover. And so we had thought, potentially to simplify Flex, it makes sense to redesign Flex around the inbound reserve product. Next slide. So sort of revisiting the feedback we got on the third revised straw proposal that I sort of briefly outlined in the prior slide. So again, while many stakeholders supported the CAISO's efforts to simplify FlexRA, there were diverging perspectives on how this goal should be accomplished. And so SCG&E and CISA commented that they did not think the CAISO should get rid of the 3-hour net load ramping requirements just yet, and that the CAISO should get more experience with the inbound reserves before modifying the Flex program to align with this new product. So again, there's sort of this desire that since the inbound reserve is sort of a new product, a new concept, there's a desire to do some testing to see how this would work in once implemented before folks felt comfortable letting go of the Flex program as is and explicitly planning for that 3-hour net load ramping period. The CPUC Energy Division staff and SCE wanted more data on what the new Flex requirements would look like. So how much inbound reserves and Flex products would be carrying on a monthly basis, as well as what the new effective flexible capacity values would look like of the existing fleet, to sort of get a better sense of, does the existing fleet have the 15-minute capability to meet the new Flex RA program requirements, to make sure that we're not setting requirements that the fleet can't meet. And so they wanted more data to make that kind of assessment. Next slide. Another group of stakeholders, this included CalCCA and Calpine, generally supported the proposal to realign FlexRA with inbound reserves, but questioned whether FlexRA was even necessary, and that the CAISO should consider getting rid of the FlexRA program entirely, especially if the requirements were non-binding. So again, they supported this general direction to simplify Flex to align with inbound reserves, and then take an additional step forward to even do an evaluation of whether the FlexRA program is even needed, or if with the redesigned day-ahead market, would you be able to cover your flexibility needs with the existing system and local resources? And then other stakeholders have specific questions and comments on various details of the CAISO's proposal, such as specific Mustoffer Obligations, resource-specific characteristics that would make them eligible or ineligible to provide FlexRA, as well as upfront showing requirements. So next slide. So given this mixed stakeholder feedback and sort of these three competing perspectives, as well as additional concerns raised internally, the CAISO has decided to adopt a staged approach to modifying FlexRA. And so the benefits of this staged approach are that it will allow the CAISO to meet our immediate need to develop complementary RA program requirements to align with the day-ahead market enhancements. It will also give us additional time to gain operational experience with the new inbound reserve product. We're trying to be responsive to stakeholders' requests to implement and then evaluate the effectiveness of inbound reserves before changing Flex, as well as provide sort of this safety and guardrails of the RA program to retain planning and procuring resources to meet the 3-hour net load ramp requirements of the existing Flex RA program. And so this will allow time for more analysis from the CAISO on how well DAME is scheduling resources to meet the 3-hour net load ramp. So the idea is, let's keep Flex RA as is, implement some changes needed to make sure that we have sufficient bids for inbound reserves, do a period of testing and evaluation, and then once we have clearer guidance on sort of the effectiveness of the day-ahead market changes, be able to make a more informed decision around what to do with Flexray. So I will pause here, see if there's any questions about kind of where we've been before we move on to the actual proposal.
As a reminder to raise your hand, if you use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you can press the raise hand icon located above the chat window. If you dialed in separately to the conference, you'll need to press #2 to raise your hand.
All right. I do not currently see any questions in queue.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So then we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so this next series of slides is going to lay out more details of the staged approach that the CAISO has developed to address the flexibility needs. So stage 1 will be implemented in step with day-ahead market enhancements, which is currently scheduled for fall 2022, so it would be applicable for our year 2023. Again, the day-ahead market enhancements initiative is an ongoing initiative, and so the implementation timelines may change in the future, and so the CAISO's intent is to align stage 1 with the implementation schedule of the day-ahead market enhancements, while also trying to align those with the RA years. So just know that right now we're expecting this to go into effect for our year 2023. However, that could be pushed back slightly depending on how the DAME implementation schedule develops. So with that said, again, in stage 1, the Flexray program that the CAISO currently runs will remain unchanged. And so for this first round, we're not proposing any modification to the Flexray study, the requirements, the EFC methodologies, et cetera, at this time. So again, for the foreseeable future, Flexray will remain the same. What we are changing, however, is we are modifying the must-offer obligation of RA resources to ensure that we have sufficient bids for imbalance reserve. So what this means is that we're going to modify the must-offer obligation to require all imbalance reserve eligible resources, whether they're shown as flex, system, or local, would now be obligated to economically bid for energy, ancillary services, and submit $0 bids for imbalance reserve. Currently, under the day-ahead market enhancements, imbalance reserve eligible resources are those that are 15 and 5-minute dispatchable for resources that use the CAISO generated forecast, as well as short start resources that can be started in real time within 15 minutes. Again, the eligibility of resources is still being finalized in the day-ahead market enhancements. And so the idea in the RA enhancements initiative is that we would be seeking to align eligibility requirements still in DAME with this must-offer obligation change. So resources would still be able to self-schedule energy award in real time, but they would be obligated to economically bid in any imbalance awards. And this would allow the real-time market to schedule resources around any of the plan for uncertainty that actually materializes in real time, as well as imbalance reserves obligation would be subject to RAME. So we would also be proposing to modify RAME to account for this new requirement to bid for imbalance reserves if you are an imbalance reserve eligible resource. Next slide. So the CAISO recognizes that this is potentially a drastic change for some resources on their must-offer obligation if they are an imbalance reserve eligible resource. And so we recognize that the change to the must-offer obligation to align with imbalance reserves may not be appropriate for all resource types that are eligible to provide imbalance reserves. And so the CAISO seeks stakeholder feedback on if we need to consider exemptions to these new economic bidding requirements. So for instance, one thing we thought of is that the CAISO has heard from storage resources that the real-time market may make it difficult for them to manage their resources cycling costs, and subjecting them to economic bidding day ahead could exacerbate this. And so the CAISO may consider delaying modifications to the storage move to economically bid for energy and imbalance reserves day ahead, to delay that to provide the CAISO time to implement changes under development in the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative to help mitigate some of these concerns. And so that's one example. And so we are looking for feedback on if there are other resource types or considerations that should take into account that may impact a resource's ability to economically bid for energy, ancillary services, and imbalance reserves day ahead, whether they're shown for system, flex, or local. So with that, I will pause for questions on stage one or anything covered so far.
All right, we do have questions in queue. Cole, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Hello, this is Alvis Svoboda again from PG&E. I wanted to raise another point, just more of a detail on even if you were to go forward with the idea that storage resources did have the obligation to bid their imbalances in real time. I don't believe currently that cyber actually allows storage resources to do that. You can't really put in a self-schedule and bid upward and downward from it. And I believe it's not even possible if you have a charging self-schedule, it's not even possible to do anything but put in the charging self-schedule. That could have changed. Was my experience trying to work with cyber more than a year ago on a storage resource, but you want to look closely at what is actually possible to do in cyber and putting these kinds of requirements together. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alba, for that note. I will take that back to the team to discuss further.
Hi, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Hi. Can we go back one slide on slide 22? I just want to make sure I heard this correctly. What you're proposing is that even if a resource is not committed as Flex RA and only generic RA, as long as the resource is eligible to provide imbalance reserves, then it will have a must-offer obligation for effectively Flex. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's basically what it does. That's correct.
Okay, and then if that's the case, is that a 24/7 product, or is that the same RAIM, Flex RA RAIM assessment hour product?
No, that would be 24/7, or if a resource has a different, if they're a, as capable resource or as expected must offer, and then they could also use outage cards to indicate if they had some other limitation from that 24/7, but the expectation would, or the default would be that 24/7 must offer obligation.
Okay, and then if that's the case, when you, on the very last bullet, the imbalance reserve obligation would then be subject to RAIM, then what are the assessment hours relative for that? Is it 24/7 or are we back to the 17 hours?
So the how it would be applied to RAIM is that if the resource was shown for generic, then it would only have the standard RAIM hours, so it'd be those 5 RAIM assessment hours. If the resource was shown as flex, then the assessment hours would be the flex assessment hours, and then imbalance reserves would just be added into that assessment. And so what we're kind of thinking about now, and in the next paper, we plan to provide more details about how the RAIM implementation would work. But what we're currently thinking is today, the RAIM considers for energy awards, did the resource bid in during the RAIM assessment hours up to their shown RA amount. And so for imbalance reserves, we would be doing a similar assessment, and then the final RAIM calculation, we'd be looking at the minimum. So, for instance, say you were a 100 megawatt resource and had 100 megawatts of generic system RA. So for energy RAIM purposes, we would be looking to see, did you bid in the full 100 megawatts during those RAIM assessment hours? And then with imbalance reserves, we'd be looking also, did you submit $0 bids for imbalance reserves during that same period? So for, say, you only bid in 80 megawatts of imbalance reserves, then for the RAIM calculation, we'd be taking the minimum, so you would be assessed at that 80 megawatts that you bid in for imbalance reserves. So it'd be the minimum between the two.
Okay, got it. Thanks for that. And then on the bullet with regards to the submit $0 bids for imbalance reserves, I know since this is sort of a, I guess, the trial run, have you considered not requiring a $0 bid, but rather allowing market participants to bid in at a, a sort of a value of their choosing, but then if the resource is qualified for either for imbalance reserve or shown as flex RA, then the system itself sort of would override that and create that to become a $0 bid. The reason is so that you can have a little bit more sort of robustness on your data set for your inputs when you're clearing the market later on to see, how well the market's clearing during the trial run to see sort of the quickness and whether or not stacking up different bids correctly.
Mm-hmm. We hadn't considered that, but I see your point about that potentially producing a more robust data set and potentially more information during the transition period to then help adjust RA contracts when we do eventually require economic bidding for imbalance reserves. So I can definitely take that kind of idea back to the team for their just considerations about how we might implement that aspect of the policy.
Okay, thanks so much. That's it for me. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Noah.
Okay, we have a couple questions in the chat. So the first one from City of Pasadena, please clarify why the ISO is proposing to not allow RA resources to self-schedule in day ahead as they do today and meet their MU obligation. That is not clearly stated in the proposal.
Yes, thank you for that question. So this change is really driven by the day-ahead market enhancements. So in the IFM, what we're proposing is that a resource would be, or the market would be co-optimizing between energy awards, AS, and imbalance awards. And so in order to allow the day-ahead market to co-optimize between those three products, we needed to sort of facilitate the co-optimization, you would also need to require economic bidding for energy so that the market kind of can trade off between how much of the resources capacity awards for energy versus how much is it reserved for imbalance reserves. And so we felt that allowing resources to self-schedule, they could essentially self-schedule themselves out of needing to provide imbalance reserves. And so in order, again, to let the day-ahead market co-optimize between the three products, you would need to have economic bids for all three products.
Thanks, Bridget. And then we have another question in the chat, let's see, from Pasadena Water and Power. It says, is there any effort to have regulatory bodies have grid charging energy reflect the amount of renewables on the grid? For example, if the grid was 95% renewable, right now regulatory bodies count that as a brown energy, even though it is 95% green. This may mitigate the ITC tax exposure issue commensurate with the percent renewable extent on the grid.
Yeah, thanks for that suggestion. I don't know of any specific efforts to make that argument. I know, the CAISO internal discussions have talked about the fact that, yes, during the middle of the day, the CAISO can be, majority renewable. And I think it has to do more so with the language of the ITC and the clear evidence that lawyers can make that the resource, basically the clearest way to prove that the resource only charged from renewable sources is to show that it only charged for on-site solar. So I think it's sort of a weakness in the language of the ITC bill, but I don't know of any other efforts to sort of clarify that. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. And then I see we have one more in the verbal queue, so if we want to go to Grant.
Cool, you may go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yes, thank you. I just want to clarify at first that the $0 bids will only be for 2023. Is that correct?
It will be through the game transition period. So starting in 2023, when imbalance reserves go into effect, yes, you'll be doing $0 bidding. I think the last I looked at the DAME policy, there wasn't quite an end date, or we had also discussed ending it when EDAM goes into effect. And so the length of time the $0 bids would be in play is still under development in DAME. And so in this policy, we would be sort of trying to align with whatever the transition timeline that was developed under DAME.
Okay, well, so it could potentially go out as far as 2026 then.
Potentially.
And I think that's a serious problem because there's an opportunity cost that could be lost by allowing to bid into balance reserves. And if you have energy storage or energy storage hybrids, and you talked about the difficulties, part of the difficulty is there is an opportunity cost for me to bid this into a balance reserves. And you're removing that economic incentive for me to develop these products and bring them to the market. And how do I put them into the market if you're not going to pay for them? Right? There has to be some way for me to reflect that this product's going to get chosen over another one. And so I think this whole $0 bid idea is a terrible idea, number one, but especially for, the next 6 years. It's just, I really think that should be rethought.
Yeah, thanks for the comments, Grant.
The data said if you don't have any bids.
Yeah. Hey, Bridget, this is Greg Cook. I can help out here a little. I don't think it would be, first off, the opportunity costs would be paid through the market. The market would calculate what the opportunity costs are for providing imbalance reserves. The bids are really the cost for that being available into the real-time market. I think primarily we were looking at, ranging fuel supplies, those types of things. That being said, we got a lot of comments that these costs, the real-time Mustoffer obligation costs, are already built into the RA contracts. We were looking for a transition period for this. But when this would end, I think, the latest it could end would be when we were to implement EDAM, because we would then need to have these bids in place so that we could economically schedule imbalance reserves across the entire region for meeting the requirements. So we maintain the $0 bid requirement. Clearly, we could be at risk of having California RA resources providing all the imbalance reserves for the region. So that's, I think, the longest this would go would be until we implement EDAM. And currently EDAM, which we'll be talking about tomorrow, we're targeting that for go live sometime in 2024. So it wouldn't be out as long as 2026. It would be, right now the target's spring of 2024. Whether we hit that or not remains to be seen, but that's the current target date.
Okay, just one last comment. I believe that this, the $0 bid is going to be a pretty big constraint for batteries and hybrids that are modeled as NGRs to be able to participate. And because you're not able to manage it, and I believe that having that capacity reservation fee would allow units to be able to manage themselves in that market, because that's not part of that cost that's taken into account, so to speak, now. And so, as we talk through whether energy storage is going to be allowed to provide imbalance reserves or not, it's a question. I mean, I believe that a lot more energy storage would participate if they didn't have to bid zero.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Grant. And I would just encourage you to also put those in your written comments, especially since we are, seeking stakeholder feedback on possible exemptions. And so I think it would be good to have your feedback on, why this might be problematic for storage and hybrid resources, for us to consider additional modifications to this policy.
All right, we have a few more in the chat, so I'll go to the first from CDWR. Will an ineligible resource for imbalance reserve still be required to offer economic bid for energy and ancillary services in the day-ahead market?
No, those resources would not have any changes to their must-offer obligations that weren't already covered in on this section. So if they're allowed to self-schedule today, they would be allowed to in the future. This is only for, this economic bidding requirement for energy day ahead is only applicable to resources that are eligible to provide imbalance reserves, as I said, so that the market can co-optimize between those products.
All right, the next question from City of Pasadena. SAME allows for self-schedules, so it is unclear why RA enhancements is not allowing day-ahead self-schedules. Some resources are needed to operate for a subset of hours in a month to ensure reliability of the local distribution system. This is currently accomplished through day-ahead self-schedules. Would that prevent them from counting for system and/or local RA under this proposal? And how would we accomplish this if we cannot self-schedule in the day ahead going forward? We do not know which days and which hours in advance, so the ISO will see less RA resources going forward if day-ahead self-schedules are not allowed.
Yeah, thanks for that. This is a kind of an example of instances where we might need to modify the policy, and so I would really encourage you to put that in your written comments and to provide a little bit more detail. That are there specific resource types that you use in this way, or there are certain contract terms, and that would help us know how we could potentially create exemptions to this policy or modifications, because our goal isn't to diminish, RA capacity and what resources participate in the RA markets. And so, we started off with a sort of broad firm policy, but also realized that it may not work for all resource types. And so we would love to hear more about instances where self-scheduling needs to be allowed and under what conditions. So again, that we can better shape this policy to meet, our needs to have our resources providing imbalance reserves with, all the other, reliability needs that we're trying to get through Flex System and Local.
Thanks, Bridget. I'm not seeing any others in the chat. Do we have any on the phone line?
There are currently no questions in queue on the phone.
Okay. Great. Okay, so moving on, the next slides preview what the CAISO's intent is for how we're going to continue to consider changes to the FlexRA program. And so stage 2 and 3, we're not proposing any specific changes, but rather trying to make stakeholders aware of sort of our long-term thinking around how we're approaching changes to FlexRA. So stage 2, you can think of as an evaluation period. And so this, we're expecting this to run 1 to 2 years. So right now we have it running RA year 2023 to 2024. And during this stage, the purpose of stage 2 is to allow the CAISO time to gain operational experience with imbalance reserves and additional modifications to the day-ahead market processes developed under DAME. And so for our year 2023, the CAISO will collect data on the performance of imbalance reserves under a variety of grid conditions. We will also be looking to evaluate how well the day-ahead market optimizes the resource fleet to meet the predictable ramping needs of the system, including the morning and evening ramps. So again, looking to see how well the day-ahead market is optimizing the existing portfolio of resources to cover both the uncertainty needs designed to be covered by imbalance reserves, as well as how well we are at scheduling resources to meet the predictable 3-hour net load ramping period. Next slide. And then as part of stage 2, likely starting in Q4 of 2023, again, this is tentative, but the CAISO intends to conduct a stakeholder process to share these findings with the broader stakeholder community in order to determine whether a separate FlexRA program and requirement is necessary to cover the 3-hour net load ramping requirements, and whether there are additional enhancements needed to the existing FlexRA program, such as EFT methodologies or study methodologies. So this first bullet is trying to assess whether we still need a FlexRA product designed to cover the 3-hour net load ramping requirement. And if we still need this product, are there additional enhancements we need to how resources are counted for this product, or how we study the need for this product? So again, looking to see if we're going to retain FlexRA for the long haul, are there additional improvements or enhancements we want to make? And so the stage 2 would be trying to answer that question. We would also be evaluating whether a separate FlexRA requirement is necessary to get sufficient imbalance reserve bids, such as the FlexRA program should be redesigned to more explicitly align with the imbalance reserve product. So again, right now we're just requiring all imbalance reserve eligible resources to have to bid for it. And so there's not really a way for resources to opt in or out of providing this product. And so it might be desirable to have something like a separate FlexRA requirement program designed specifically around procuring resources to specifically meet our imbalance reserve requirements. And so here we may want to revisit the proposal developed in the third straw proposal of RA enhancements, where we did explicitly redesign Flex around imbalance reserves. And so it may be prudent to move forward with that proposal and continue to refine it. And then finally, through this evaluation period, we may find that there are additional operational challenges not addressed by DAME that may require a new RA requirement to help address or align with any additional market products or changes that may result from this analysis. So what we have heard from some of our operators is a growing concern of the intra 5-minute flexibility needs and need resources that can ramp even faster. And so in this analysis, it also kind of leaves room for if we identify other operational challenges that we need a Flex product to help address. We could also consider those kinds of changes in this stakeholder process to reevaluate Flexray. Next slide. And then stage 3 would be the implementation of the redesigned Flexray program that resulted from the analysis and stakeholder process in stage 2. So likely in either our year 2025 or 2026, depending on the length of the stakeholder process and the implementation burden of the new Flex program will depend the start date of stage 3. But the idea behind stage 3 is when we would be implementing or sunsetting a redesigned Flexray program, and this would be done in coordination with the CPUC, since Flexray is sort of a shared and jointly administered program with the CPUC. And so stage 3, again, would be coordinated with the CPUC and making sure it aligns with their processes. And so stage 3 is when we would be implementing a redesigned Flexray program that would be based on the analysis and stakeholder engagement that happened in stage 2. So with that, I will stop for any questions on stage 2 and stage 3.
All right. I don't see any questions in queue right now on WebEx. I don't see any questions in queue on the phone either.
Okay, I did just see another question come in the chat from City of Pasadena. Going back to the prior discussion regarding day-ahead self-scheduling, if a base load import resource has a minimum output, this is currently self-scheduled, and then the energy above the minimum is bidden for energy, and day-ahead self-schedules are not allowed. How would we be communicated to the ISO that the minimum megawatt hour will be delivered via self-schedule today?
Would these base imports be hourly or 15-minute dispatchable resources? If they're hourly resources, they're not eligible for inbound reserves, and so the imports could still self-schedule. If they are 15-minute dispatchable imports, that's where a potential issue might arise that we'd have to talk about more internally. Okay, and it looks like they did provide the clarification that it would be dynamic and hourly. Okay. Yeah, so I think if they're hourly resources, they're currently not eligible for inbound reserves, and so they would not have any change to their must-offer obligation. If they were, again, 15-minute dispatchable resources, their must-offer obligation would be changing, and so that might be an instance where we might have to consider additional changes. So definitely take that back to the team for their discussions, and would encourage you to put that in your comments again as well.
Okay, another question just came in back on page 12. Can the ISO indicate where the red line version of the BPM has been published? The version on the CAISO website does not reflect any changes to table 7.1.1, nor does PRR 1364.
It is. So this is Anya. Go ahead, Bridget.
Oh, no, you go.
I was just going to mention it's the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Phase 2 straw proposal. It is in the appendix as red line, so you may need to scroll through, but the red line is there. It is not a part of PRR 1364.
All right.
I'm
it looks like
not seeing any more in the chat, so let's jump to the queue.
Yep. All right, Cole, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
All right. I do not see any questions in queue on the phone, Isabel.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so next slide. So as a reminder, the CAISO has already completed its implementation of phase 1 of our enhancements. And under this, we implemented plan outage process enhancements phase 1, operationalizing storage, and then the local studies with availability limited resources CPM clarification. So this was additional CPM authority to ensure that local resources meet the energy and capacity needs of the local area. And so that will be in effect for our year 2022. So for phase 2, which is what we discussed today, we're proposing a fall 2022 implementation for our year 2023. And so this would cover the changes to the Mustoffer Obligation and bid insertion rules. And then Flexray stage 1, while we expect it to still be implemented in fall 2022, that implementation will be tied to the DAME implementation. And so if there are any additional delays with DAME, then Flexray stage 1 would also be delayed. And so, but regardless of where DAME is at, for sure, the Mustoffer Obligation and bid insertion rules that Anya went over will be going into effect fall 2022 for our year 2023. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the EIM governing body role. So as most folks are aware, we adopted new rules for the EIM governing body's shared governance. And so in light of those new rules, we have revisited the EIM governing body determination for RA phase 2. So under the new charter for EIM governance, the EIM governing body may provide advisory input over proposal to change or establish tariff rules that would apply to the real-time market, but are not within the scope of joint authority. So under this advisory role, this applies to real-time market changes that still only apply to the CAISO BA. The EIM governing body still has an optional advisory role. So in light of that, the CAISO staff believes that the EIM governing body would have an advisory role with respect to the following proposed changes. So this would be setting the resource adequacy Mustoffer obligation for storage resources to its full charge and discharge capability, and inserting bids for resource adequacy use limited resources and conditionally availability resources. So again, because these modify how resources are participating in the real-time market, staff feels that the EIM governing body has the option to provide advisory input to the board on these changes. Next slide. However, there are elements within our enhancements phase 2 that are outside of the EIM governing body's advisory role. So all other elements would fall outside of this advisory role. This includes proposed rules about use limited resources that apply only to the day-ahead market. So day-ahead bid insertion, again, would not be subject to the EIM governing body's advisory role. As well as we've identified some policies that may not require any tariff modification and thus would not require board approval. This includes that use limited resources should have the standard RA obligation and submit outage tickets to show unavailability. So again, this is an existing tariff and BPM expectation that resources that aren't physically available use outage cards to reflect that. And so for use limited resources, again, this just is clarifying that they should follow the existing rules. And then RA resources must be available in real time for actionable dispatch. Again, this is an existing expectation. And then finally, resource adequacy intermittent resources may not support certain exports. Again, we're not proposing any tariff changes, but rather clarifying the policy intent. So we are seeking stakeholder feedback on the EIM governing body role designation, and so please include that in your comments. So with that, that wraps up the prepared materials. We do have some time left, and so I will open it back up for any questions on anything we've covered so far or anything else folks would like to bring up.
All right, looks like we do have a question. Cole, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thank you. This is Barbara Barkovich for CLECAC. Demand response is a use-limited resource, but I seem to recall, and I'm a little bit rusty about this, that it was not able to submit outage tickets when it's not available. Has that changed?
That has not changed, but I think we are, DR would have its own set of rules. And so as Anya clarified, we're, by default, they have the 24/7 must offer, but if the resource or program design and the LRA has approved a different set of must offer obligations, the CAISO is going to be collecting documentation on those new rules. And so the resource would be held to those must offer obligations.
Okay, so this particular provision would fall under that, and therefore the issue of outage tickets is not relevant.
That is my understanding.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear because some of these statements are pretty broad. So thank you for that.
All right. I do not see any additional questions for folks who dialed in on the phone line. As a reminder, you can press #2 if you dialed in the regular audio. And I think for those of you on WebEx, to press the raise hand icon. But I don't see anything right now.
Okay. Not seeing anything in the chat either. Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, we can go into next steps. So again, we will have an open comment period until October 26th. We encourage you to submit your written comments through the commenting tool. A template is available out on the initiative webpage, so you can access that anytime between now and the 26th. And the initiative webpage is linked here on this slide for you. A few other things before we wrap up. The ISO did recently launch its Energy Matters blog, which provides timely insights into the ISO grid and market operations, as well as some other industry-related news. We've highlighted a recent article here for you to take a look at. You can click the image on this slide, and it will take you out to the article. You can also subscribe to the Energy Matters blog monthly summary, and that subscription link is available for you on this slide as well. And then lastly, I just wanted to encourage all of you to register for the Extended Day Ahead Market Forum, which we will be hosting tomorrow from 8:30 to noon. It is a free virtual webinar for all those interested. The registration does end today, so if you haven't registered already, you have until the end of today to do so. We've included a link to the page for you to register here on this slide. Again, it does close today, and the event will be tomorrow from 8:30 to noon. The objective of the event is to foster a regional discussion driven by the transformational changes and opportunities developing in the West. And the discussion will mainly focus on how the value of optimization and coordination of grid resources can be unlocked by expanding the ISO day-ahead market to entities within the Western interconnection. And the forum will include discussion with industry leaders, so that includes the utility representatives, policymakers, and stakeholders all across the West who will share perspectives on some of the key concepts and principles critical to the development of an EDM framework. So again, the registration link is available to you here on this page. But if you have any questions, please feel free to send those to isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. So I'll just open it again for any last questions before we conclude.
All right. I do not see any questions in the queue.
Okay. Then that concludes today's stakeholder call. Thank you very much for joining and have a great rest of your day.